The smell of ozone and hot dust hung in the air of Marcus Vance's garage workshop, a familiar perfume of resurrection. His long, graceful fingers, stained with grease but steady as a surgeon's, navigated the intricate guts of a vintage tube amplifier. In this detached garage on the quieter side of Little Elm, Texas, surrounded by the ghosts of discarded toasters and coffee makers, Marcus didn't just fix things, he brought them back to life. It was a skill that had earned him a reputation as the best damn repairman in the county, a man who could coax a soul back into a dead machine. At 29, he was a pillar of quiet competence, a young black man building a respectable life with his own two hands. His phone buzzed on the workbench, rattling against a stray screwdriver. He wiped his hands on a rag, a smile touching his lips before he even saw the name. Aaliyah. "Hey you," he said, his voice instantly softening. "Shouldn't you be terrorizing some poor intern at the clinic?" Aaliyah's laugh was like wind chimes, clear and bright. "Very funny. I just got off my shift. I was calling the caterer. They confirmed the final head count. Can you believe it? 3 more days, Mark. Just 3 days until you're stuck with me forever." The garage, with its shadows and scent of machine oil, suddenly felt miles away from her world of sterile white hallways and bright futures. This was the polarity of his life, the gritty, tangible present of his workshop, and the clean, luminous future Aaliyah represented. He looked around at his organized chaos, a world he controlled completely, and then thought of her neat, sunlit apartment on the other side of town. She was his future, the blueprint for a normal, happy life he'd always craved. "I think I can handle that," he said, the smile in his voice genuine. "Don't work too hard. I'll see you tonight." "You too. I love you, Marcus." "Love you too, Aaliyah." He hung up, the warmth of her voice lingering. He was a lucky man. Aaliyah James was everything a man could want. Smart, a dedicated nurse with dreams of becoming a doctor, kind to a fault, and so beautiful it sometimes made his chest ache. She was his chance to finally build a family, to erase the gaping hole left by a mother he barely remembered, a woman who had vanished from his life when he was just a child. He was about to turn back to the amplifier when the phone buzzed again. This time, his smile vanished. His entire body tensed. He glanced instinctively toward the garage door, as if someone could be watching. The screen displayed a single letter, E. His thumb hovered over the screen. A wave of something cold and heavy, a mixture of guilt, desire, and dread, washed over him. This was the other side of the coin, the dark magnetic pole to Aaliyah's bright north. He was a man living a double life, standing on a fault line he'd created himself, and he could feel the ground beneath his feet beginning to tremble. He took a deep breath, the smell of ozone now feeling suffocating, and answered the call. His voice changed again, dropping an octave, becoming softer, more intimate. A voice reserved only for her. "Hey you," he murmured. The voice on the other end was husky, textured with age and smoke, but it held a warmth that melted his resolve every single time. "Are you coming tonight, baby? I'm making those smothered pork chops you like." He closed his eyes, picturing her. Her hands calloused from a lifetime of work, but surprisingly gentle. Her eyes, the color of dark amber, that saw through his carefully constructed walls. He thought of Aaliyah's bright apartment, filled with wedding magazines and fabric swatches, a future he was supposed to want. Then he thought of the cramped, cozy apartment above the diner, a place that felt more like home than any place he'd ever known, a place that smelled of fried chicken and secrets. "Of course," he whispered, the lie to Aaliyah already a bitter taste in his mouth. "I'll be there around 8. He ended the call and stood motionless in the center of his workshop. The perfectly repaired amplifier sat on his bench, a testament to his skill, but his own life was a shattered, complicated mess of wires, and he had no idea how to fix it. He was engaged to be married in 3 days to a woman he loved, a woman who represented his future, and tonight he was going to see the woman who owned his passion, the woman who was his oldest and most dangerous secret. He looked at his scarred hands. They could fix anything, it seemed, except for the damage inside his own heart. The tremors along the fault line were getting stronger. 3 years earlier, Marcus Vance was just a man with a truck and a toolbox, hungry for any work that would pay the bills. The call had come on a sweltering Friday afternoon. The main oven at Ellie's Soul Food, a long-standing institution in Little Elm's older, predominantly black neighborhood, had died. It was the worst possible time, right before the weekend rush. He'd expected to find a flustered owner. Instead, he found Eleanor Ross. At 62, she moved with a purpose that defied her age, her eyes sharp and assessing as she led him to the ancient monolithic oven. She wasn't just the owner, she was the heart of the place. Her presence filled the small diner, a mix of quiet authority and a deep, weary warmth. "If you can't fix it, I'm going to have a whole lot of angry Baptists on my hands come Sunday morning," she had said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Marcus, then 26, had felt an immediate, inexplicable pull. It wasn't just her striking amber eyes or the unexpected grace in her work-worn hands. It was something else, a familiarity that settled deep in his bones, like a half-remembered song. He'd fixed the oven in under an hour, tracing a faulty wire that a dozen other repairmen had missed. As payment, she refused his invoice. "Nonsense," she insisted. "You save my weekend, you sit. I'll feed you." She served him a plate of fried chicken, so perfect it was almost a religious experience, with collard greens that tasted of home, a home he'd never really had. She sat down across from him in the worn vinyl booth, a stark contrast to the deferential way most customers treated him. She didn't just serve him, she sat with him. The conversation flowed as easily as the sweet tea she kept refilling. He talked about his ambition to build his business. She spoke of the diner, of the changing neighborhood, of her grandchildren, a detail that briefly made the 36-year age gap feel like a chasm. But as she talked, her hands gesturing with an elegant, expressive power, he saw not an old woman, but a woman forged in fire, a survivor. Her face was a roadmap of a hard life, yet her eyes held a vibrant, unconquered light. That first lunch turned into a weekly ritual. He'd stop by, first under the pretense of checking on the oven, then simply for the food and conversation. Soon, he found himself staying late, helping with a loose floorboard here, a flickering light there. He learned her rhythms, the way she hummed old blues tunes when she cooked, the fierce pride she took in her food, the deep loneliness that sometimes clouded her amber eyes when the last customer left. The diner became his sanctuary. It was a world away from the sterile, often subtly condescending interactions he had in the newer, whiter parts of town, where he was just the help, no matter how skilled. At Ellie's, he was Marcus. He was seen. The line was crossed on a rainy Tuesday night. The diner was empty, the world outside a blur of water and light. He was on a stepladder, fixing a faulty fixture above the counter. She was handing him a tool, their hands brushed. It was a simple, accidental touch, but the electricity that arced between them was anything but. The air grew thick, charged with 3 months of unspoken tension. She didn't pull her hand away. He didn't either. He looked down from the ladder, and her amber eyes were full of a question he was terrified and desperate to answer. That night, he didn't go home. They talked until the rain stopped, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. He spoke of his phantom mother, the ache of an abandonment he couldn't comprehend. She spoke of her own ghosts, the hardships and betrayals that had shaped her. In the quiet darkness of the empty diner, surrounded by the lingering smells of cornbread and coffee, the 36 years between them dissolved. He saw only a woman, beautiful and desirable. She saw not a boy, but a man with an old soul who looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. When dawn broke, painting the windows in shades of gray and pink, they were no longer just a diner owner and her repairman. They were lovers. Their affair became a creature of the night, thriving in the hours after the closed sign was flipped. Her small apartment above the diner was their world, a secret haven built on a foundation of shared loneliness and explosive passion. She gave him an unconditional acceptance he'd never known. He made her feel young, desired, and alive in a way she thought had died decades ago. It was a dangerous, intoxicating fire. Marcus knew it was wrong, a betrayal of the life he was supposed to be building. He was lying to his sister, to his friends, and eventually to Aaliyah. But he was addicted to Eleanor. She was a connection to a past he didn't understand, a balm on a wound so old he didn't know how to heal it. He told himself it was just passion, a temporary solace. But as months turned into years, he knew he was sinking deeper into a truth far more complicated and perilous than he could ever admit. He was in love with a ghost, a secret, a woman old enough to be his mother. And he had no idea she actually was. The truth of Eleanor Ross was etched into the deep lines around her eyes, a story she rarely shared. Her life hadn't been a gentle stream, it had been a raging river of survival. Born in the poorest ward of Houston, she'd escaped a brutal father only to fall into the arms of a man who promised her the world and gave her a needle instead. He left her pregnant and alone on the streets. The baby, a boy, was born silent. A kind, elderly woman who owned a small diner in Little Elm took her in, taught her the secrets of soul food and the grit of running a business. That woman became the mother she never had. But happiness was fleeting. A second child, a girl, followed by a boy, Marcus. Her husband, a long-haul trucker, was a hard man, prone to violence when the whiskey flowed too freely. The day he raised a hand to their daughter, Simone, was the day Eleanor knew she had to run. With nothing but a few dollars and the clothes on her back, she made an impossible choice. She left her 2 children with a neighbor, promising to return, and fled into the night. She never made it back. Shame, fear, and a decade of hardship kept her away. By the time she returned to Little Elm, her husband was dead. Her children had been raised by relatives, and she was a stranger to them. She bought the old diner, the one place she'd ever felt safe, and named it Ellie's. From a distance, she watched her children grow up, her heart breaking a little more each day. She was too ashamed, too broken, to reclaim the title of mother. This was the secret that simmered beneath every plate of food she served, the ghost that haunted the corners of her small apartment. Simone Vance, Marcus's older sister, felt that ghost. At 32, Simone was pragmatic and fiercely protective of her brother. She had been the one to shield him from the worst of their chaotic childhood. She remembered their mother only in fragmented, dreamlike images, but the feeling of abandonment was a scar they both shared. And for months, she'd felt a deep unease about Marcus. It started with the late nights, the vague excuses. Then, one early morning, driving to her job at the county courthouse, she saw it with her own eyes. Marcus's beat-up Ford pickup parked behind Ellie's soul food. She watched, her heart pounding, as he slipped out the back door of the diner just as the sun was rising. He looked tired, but strangely content. She confronted him that weekend. "What's going on with you and the woman who runs that diner, Mark?" she asked, her arms crossed. They were in his workshop, the familiar scent of oil and metal suddenly feeling tense. Marcus didn't look at her. He kept his hands busy, tightening a screw that didn't need tightening. "What are you talking about? Ellie? She's a friend, an old client." The polarity in the room was sharp, Simone's piercing, direct truth against Marcus's evasive, shadowy lies. "A friend you spend the night with?" Simone pressed, her voice low and sharp. "I saw you, Marcus, leaving her place at 6 a.m. She's old enough to be a grandmother. You're engaged to Aaliyah, a good woman who loves you. What the hell are you doing?" Anger flared in Marcus's eyes, a defensive fire. "It's none of your damn business, Simone. I'm a grown man. Stay out of my life." "It is my business when you're about to destroy a good woman's life, not to mention your own," she shot back. "Aaliyah doesn't deserve this. To be cheated on, lied to, for what? Some kind of weird fetish?" The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. But even Simone knew it was more than that. She'd seen the way Eleanor looked at her brother during one of the rare times she'd been in the diner. It wasn't just desire, it was a deep, aching tenderness, a look of profound, almost painful recognition. It was a look that made Simone's blood run cold, for reasons she couldn't articulate. It felt wrong, unnatural. "You don't know anything," Marcus said, his voice flat, all the anger suddenly gone, replaced by a deep weariness. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just guilt, but a profound, bottomless sorrow. It startled her. "Then tell me," she pleaded, her own anger softening into concern. "Help me understand." But he just shook his head, turning his back on her, creating a wall between them. "There's nothing to understand. I'll see you at the wedding rehearsal." Simone left the workshop feeling more disturbed than ever. It wasn't just an affair. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of navigating their family's unspoken traumas, were screaming at her. There was a deeper, darker secret coiled at the heart of Marcus's relationship with Eleanor Ross, a secret she feared had the power to burn all their lives to the ground. She just couldn't imagine what it could possibly be. With the wedding only 2 days away, the pressure on Marcus was becoming unbearable. He was living on 2 hours of sleep and a constant, gut-churning anxiety. Every loving text from Aaliyah felt like a judgment. Every call from Eleanor felt like a summons from a world he couldn't escape. The lies were piling up, each one more precarious than the last. He had to invent a plausible reason for his upcoming week-long absence for the honeymoon. He called Eleanor from the parking lot of a hardware store, the cheerful sounds of suburban life, a jarring contrast to the deceit he was spinning. "Hey, E," he began, his voice tight. "Listen, something's come up. My aunt from Houston. She's not doing well. The family wants me to come down for a week, help get her affairs in order." There was a silence on the other end of the line. It was a heavy, knowing silence that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Eleanor's intuition was a force of nature. He knew she could sense a lie, the way a predator senses fear. "Your aunt?" she finally said, her voice carefully neutral. "The one you haven't seen in 10 years? "Yeah, that one," he mumbled, feeling pathetic. "It's a family obligation. You know how it is." "I do," she said, and the simple words were laden with a history he couldn't fathom. "You do what you have to do, Marcus. Family is important." He hung up, feeling a small, cowardly wave of relief. She'd bought it. Or so he thought. But for Eleanor, the lie was a crack in the foundation. The first tremor of a devastating earthquake. His voice had been off, his story flimsy. For weeks he'd been distant, canceling plans with vague excuses. A deep, cold dread began to seep into her heart. She had always known this couldn't last forever. She'd told herself she was prepared for the day he would leave her for a younger woman, but she hadn't prepared for deception. That evening, driven by a suspicion that was rapidly hardening into certainty, she did something she had never done before. She closed the diner early and drove her old, reliable Toyota across town. She parked down the street from the new upscale apartment complex Aaliyah lived in, a place Marcus had described to her once in a careless moment. The contrast was stark. Her world was the old Little Elm, a place of worn-down storefronts, deep roots, and shared history. This was the new Little Elm, manicured lawns, identical beige buildings, and a sense of transient anonymity. It felt like another planet. She didn't have to wait long. Marcus's truck pulled into the parking lot, but he wasn't alone. Aaliyah met him at the door, her face radiant with a happiness that was like a physical blow to Eleanor. She threw her arms around his neck, and Marcus lifted her off the ground, spinning her in a circle, laughing. It was a gesture of pure, uncomplicated joy. A gesture he had never shared with Eleanor. Eleanor sank lower in her seat, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She felt a profound, visceral sickness. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the chilling realization that she was not just a secret, but a separate, sealed-off part of his life. She was the darkness to their light, the lie that made their truth possible. She watched as they went inside. A light flicked on in a second-story window. She could see their silhouettes moving behind the blinds. She saw him tuck a piece of hair behind Aaliyah's ear. She saw them kiss, a long, tender kiss that spoke of shared dreams and a future together. The pain was so intense, it was physical. It was the pain of betrayal, but it was magnified by a deeper, more primal agony she couldn't name. It was the agony of being erased. She, who had given him a secret part of her soul. She, who had been his confidant, his comfort, his hidden home. She, who had birthed him. She sat in the darkness of her car for what felt like an eternity, the sterile perfection of the apartment complex mocking her. The lie about the sick aunt was no longer just a lie. It was a profound and cruel betrayal. He wasn't just leaving her for a week. He was building a whole other life, a life where she didn't exist. She started the car, her movements stiff and robotic. The cold dread in her heart was beginning to smolder, transforming into a slow, burning, righteous rage. She had been a fool, and Eleanor Ross was nobody's fool. The next day, Eleanor moved as if in a trance. She opened the diner, her hands performing the familiar rituals of making coffee and frying bacon, but her mind was a maelstrom of pain and betrayal. The image of Marcus and Aaliyah, silhouetted in their bright, happy window, was burned onto the back of her eyelids. The nagging suspicion that had driven her across town the night before had now metastasized into a full-blown obsession. She had to know the full extent of the lie. She had to see the architecture of her own deception. She told her regulars she was feeling unwell and closed the diner at noon. She drove not to Aaliyah's apartment, but to the stately old First Baptist church on the edge of town, the one Marcus had mentioned he was helping with some pre-Easter repairs. Another lie, she now knew, but it was a breadcrumb, and she was desperate. She parked across the street, her old Toyota blending in with the quiet afternoon. She watched as Marcus arrived and met with the pastor on the church steps. They spoke for a long time, Marcus pointing and gesturing towards the main hall, the pastor nodding enthusiastically. This wasn't a repair job. It was a planning session. A terrible, cold certainty washed over Eleanor. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She waited until Marcus had driven away before she got out of the car. Her legs felt unsteady, as if the ground itself had become unreliable. She walked up the stone steps of the church, a place she hadn't set foot in for decades. On a large cork bulletin board near the entrance, among flyers for bake sales and choir practice, was a pristine, cream-colored announcement, elegantly lettered in the gold script. Her eyes scanned the words, but her brain refused to process them at first. You are joyfully invited to celebrate the wedding of Aaliyah Renee James and Marcus Cole Vance. This Saturday, June 10th, at 11 c. in the morning. This Saturday, in 2 days. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed out of her lungs. She gripped the edge of the bulletin board to keep from collapsing. The gold lettering seemed to mock her, glittering with a future she was not only excluded from, but had been used to finance, emotionally speaking. The sick aunt in Houston was a wedding. His week-long absence was a honeymoon. Every tender moment they had shared, every whispered secret in the dark, every promise that age didn't matter, now felt like a cruel and calculated manipulation. He hadn't just lied to her. He had made a mockery of her love, her vulnerability. He had used her body, her affection as a temporary harbor until his real ship came in. The pain was no longer a dull ache. It was a white-hot spear, piercing through years of accumulated grief and disappointment. The runaway teen, the grieving mother of a stillborn child, the battered wife, the abandoned mother, the lonely widow, all the ghosts of her past selves rose up inside her, screaming in a chorus of rage. She had thought Marcus was different. She had thought he was her redemption. Instead, he was just the final, most devastating betrayal. She stumbled back to her car and sat, numb, as the afternoon sun bled into a bruised twilight. When she finally drove home, the diner felt like a tomb. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her worn armchair in the dark, the silence of the apartment above the diner amplifying the storm in her mind. Just after midnight, she stood up, her movements deliberate, calm. She walked to the bedroom closet and knelt, pushing aside old shoeboxes until her fingers found the cold, hard edges of a locked metal box. The key was hidden in a jewelry box, untouched for 15 years. She opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver. It had belonged to her second husband, the trucker, who'd kept it for protection on the road. He'd taught her how to use it, just in case. She had never fired it. She picked it up. The gun was heavy, solid, an object of undeniable purpose. It felt cold against her skin, a chilling contrast to the fire raging inside her. She checked the cylinder. 6 bullets, just as he'd left them. She wasn't a killer. She was a cook, a survivor, a woman who had weathered every storm life had thrown at her. But as she held the gun, something inside her shifted. The line between pain and vengeance, between victim and executioner, began to blur. He wanted to erase her from his life. He wanted to pretend she never existed. She would make sure he never forgot her. Saturday morning dawned bright and painfully beautiful, the kind of perfect Texas day reserved for celebrations. For Aaliyah James, it was the realization of a lifelong dream. In her suite at a nearby hotel, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and hairspray. Laughter and excited chatter filled the room as her bridesmaids fussed over the final details of her veil. Looking at her reflection, radiant in a cascade of white lace, she felt a happiness so pure it was almost overwhelming. Across town, Marcus Vance stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his bow tie with trembling hands. The black tuxedo felt like a costume, the man staring back at him, a stranger. Guilt was a physical weight in his chest, a cold, heavy stone. He loved Aaliyah. He truly did. He loved the future she represented, stability, children, a normal life. But his heart was a divided territory, and a large part of it was still in a cramped apartment above a soul food diner, captive to a woman he'd betrayed in the most profound way possible. He'd tried to call Eleanor the night before, and again this morning. Both calls went straight to voicemail. He told himself it was for the best, a clean break. But the silence felt ominous, a prelude to a storm. Outside the First Baptist Church, guests began to arrive, their bright dresses and sharp suits a stark contrast to the darkness coiling in Marcus's gut. Simone, his sister, gave him a hug at the entrance, her eyes filled with a sad, knowing look that he couldn't meet. "Be a good husband to her, Marcus," she whispered, a plea and a warning in one. He took his place at the altar, the scent of flowers and old wood filling his senses. The organ music began to swell. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church swung open. And there was Aaliyah. For a moment, all the guilt, all the lies, all the fear dissolved. She was breathtaking, an angel walking towards him, her eyes locked on his, filled with nothing but love and trust. A wave of shame and a fierce protective love washed over him. He would make it up to her. He would spend the rest of his life being the man she believed he was. The ceremony was a blur of sacred words and ancient rites. The light streaming through the stained glass windows painted them in jewel tones, a scene of holy matrimony. The polarity was absolute, the sacred public vow versus the profane, secret life he was trying to bury. "Do you, Marcus Cole Vance, take Aaliyah Renee James to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" the pastor asked, his voice echoing in the silent church. Marcus looked into Aaliyah's shining eyes. This was it, the point of no return. He opened his mouth to seal his future, to choose the light. "I do." The words had barely left his lips when the heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked open again. The sound was jarring, a discordant note in the sacred symphony. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the bright morning sun, stood Eleanor Ross. She was wearing a simple dark blue dress, her face a mask of chilling calm. Her amber eyes, usually so full of warmth, were flat and empty, fixed on him. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Aaliyah's hand tightened on his. "Mark, who is that?" she whispered, her voice laced with confusion. "Eleanor," was all he could manage, his own voice a choked whisper. She took a step forward, then another, her movements unnervingly deliberate. From the large purse slung over her shoulder, she pulled her hand. It was holding the old black Smith & Wesson revolver. Panic erupted. A woman screamed. Guests scrambled from their pews, a wave of chaos and terror. Time seemed to slow down. Marcus saw everything with a horrifying clarity. Aaliyah's face contorting in fear, his sister Simone rising from her seat with a cry of, "No!" The pastor's shocked, open mouth. But his eyes were locked on Eleanor's. In that final, eternal second, he saw the flicker of a lifetime of pain in her gaze, the pain he had caused and the pain that had been there long before him. Before he could scream, before he could move, before he could do anything but register the absolute ruin of his life, she raised the gun. A single deafening crack echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the church, a sound of finality, of a promise broken and a life shattered. A blossom of fire bloomed from the barrel. Marcus felt a violent sledgehammer blow to his chest. The world spun, the stained glass windows melting into a kaleidoscope of color. He looked down and saw a dark, impossible flower spreading across the white of his shirt. He collapsed to his knees, his last conscious thought a single, devastating realization. The woman who had given him life had just tried to take it away. Detective Frank Miller arrived to the sound of sirens wailing a mournful song over Little Elm. At 58, with 2 years left until retirement, Miller moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had seen too much to be hurried by chaos. The Saturday morning sun was already hot and unforgiving, and he hated Saturday shifts. They were a stark reminder that the rest of the world had lives, families, and weddings to attend. "What have we got, Henderson?" he asked, a young, eager officer manning the yellow crime tape stretched across the church entrance. "Shooting detective, broad daylight, right in the middle of a wedding ceremony." Henderson, barely 25, was practically buzzing with adrenaline. Witnesses say an older black woman walked in, shot the groom at the altar, and fled. Victims on his way to County General, critical condition. Miller nodded, his face impassive, and ducked under the tape. Inside, the church was a desecrated sanctuary. The polarity was sickening. Pristine white flower arrangements were trampled, satin ribbons torn, and near the altar, a dark, ugly stain of blood soaked into the plush red carpet. This should have been a place of hope. Now it was just a crime scene. His gaze fell on the bride. Aaliyah James sat numbly in a front pew, her stunning white dress horrifically smeared with Marcus's blood. She stared blankly ahead, her eyes like shattered glass, while her bridesmaids fluttered around her, their own faces streaked with tears. Some people, huh? Another young officer, a white kid named Richards, muttered to his partner, just loud enough for Miller to hear. Can't even get married without drama in this part of town. Miller's jaw tightened. It was the kind of casual, low-grade racism he'd been hearing for 30 years. The easy dismissal of black tragedy as just drama. He shot Richards a look that could curdle milk. Richards, go make yourself useful. Canvass the block. Talk to anyone who saw anything. Now. The young cop scurried off. Miller approached his lead sergeant, a solid, no-nonsense cop named Davis. ID on the victim and shooter? Victim is Marcus Vance, 29, local repairman. The shooter, according to half a dozen witnesses, is Eleanor Ross, 65. Owns Ellie's Soul Food over on Maple Street. Davis flipped through his notepad. Motive appears to be a classic lover's scorn. She walked in, said his name, and fired one shot. Dropped the weapon and vanished in the panic. Miller grunted. It seemed open and shut. Too open and shut. He walked over to the altar. The weapon, an old .38 revolver, lay on the floor where it had been dropped. Beside it, almost hidden under a pew, was a dark blue woman's scarf. He carefully bagged them both. A scorned lover might shoot someone, but to do it in a packed church and then vanish like a ghost, that took a different kind of nerve, or a different kind of desperation. He approached the bride, crouching down to her eye level. Ms. James, I'm Detective Miller. I know this is an impossible time, but I have to ask. Do you know a woman named Eleanor Ross? Aaliyah slowly turned her vacant eyes to him. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. No, she whispered, her voice raw and broken. I've never seen her before in my life. She choked on a sob. He just said her name. Miller's instincts, honed by decades of interviews, told him she was telling the truth. The bride had no idea who the shooter was. This wasn't a simple love triangle. This was something else, something messier. Get me everything on Eleanor Ross, he ordered Davis. Address, financials, known associates, last known location, and get a unit to her diner and apartment. See if she went home. He had a feeling she wouldn't be that careless. As his team fanned out, Miller stood alone at the altar, surveying the scene. The bloodstain, the fallen flowers, the terrified bride. This wasn't just a shooting. This was a statement, an act of profound theatrical violence designed to destroy not just a man, but the very idea of his happiness. The pieces were there, but they didn't fit together cleanly. A 65-year-old woman with no prior record, a beloved local business owner, commits a brazen act of violence and then disappears into thin air. It didn't add up. He thought about the scarf. It was the only piece of evidence that felt personal, a mistake, a scent article. In a town this size, a fugitive couldn't hide for long. But Eleanor Ross wasn't just any fugitive. She was a ghost. And to catch a ghost, you needed a hunter with senses beyond the human. Davis, Miller called out, his decision made. Get on the horn with dispatch. I want the K9 unit out here, now. An hour later, a black and white SUV from the Collin County Sheriff's Office pulled up, and out jumped Deputy Mike Torres and his partner, Shadow. Shadow was a magnificent German shepherd, all black and tan muscle, his intelligent eyes taking in the chaotic scene with a calm, focused intensity. In the world of law enforcement, a K9-like Shadow was the great equalizer, an animal whose senses could cut through human deception and confusion. Miller, Torres said with a nod, his hand resting reassuringly on Shadow's back. Heard you had a mess. Understatement of the year, Miller grunted. He held up the evidence bag containing Eleanor's scarf. Shooter dropped this. She's a 65-year-old woman, name of Eleanor Ross, vanished from the scene. We need a track. Torres knelt, presenting the open bag to Shadow. The dog pushed his long nose into the bag, inhaling deeply, his whole body a study in concentration. He was processing a world of information Miller couldn't even imagine. The scent of Eleanor's perfume, her sweat, the lingering smell of her diner, and beneath it all, the sharp metallic tang of her fear and adrenaline. After a few seconds, Shadow pulled back, let out a soft whine, and looked expectantly at Torres. He had the scent. Such, Torres commanded in German. Seek. Shadow put his nose to the ground and began to work. He bypassed the main entrance where the guests had fled and led them immediately to a small, unassuming side door near the choir room, an exit only someone familiar with the church might use. Already the dog was confirming Miller's suspicion. This wasn't a random act. It was planned. The track was on. Shadow moved with a low, powerful gait, pulling Torres along behind him. They moved past the church, through an alleyway, and into the older residential streets of Little Elm. The polarity of the chase was striking, the high-tech pursuit of a modern police force against the primal, desperate flight of one woman. The dog was relentless. He led them through backyards and across quiet streets, his nose glued to an invisible trail. Miller and a handful of uniformed officers followed, their radios crackling with updates. The trail was fresh. They were closing in. The chase led them into the dense, overgrown woods of Cottonwood Park, a slice of wilderness cutting through the town. Here, the terrain became difficult. The sun was hot, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Shadow navigated the tangled undergrowth with ease, but the officers struggled to keep up. The dog was in his element, a predator on the hunt. "He's got a strong track," Torres yelled back to Miller. "She came through here, no doubt about it." Hope surged through Miller. They were going to get her. But just as they broke through the trees on the far side of the park, Shadow suddenly stopped. He stood at the edge of a curb, whining in frustration, turning in circles. His nose went up in the air, then back down to the pavement, then up again. The trail had ended. They were standing at a city bus stop. The scent of Eleanor Ross, so strong just moments before, was now completely obliterated, masked by the exhaust fumes, the hot asphalt, and the lingering sense of dozens of people who had come and gone. "Damn it!" Torres spat, patting Shadow's neck. "She got on a bus. The trail's contaminated. It's gone." Miller stood on the sidewalk, the midday sun beating down on him, and felt a familiar wave of frustration. Eleanor Ross wasn't just a desperate old woman. She was smart. She knew the church's layout. She knew to use the woods for cover, and she knew a bus stop was a perfect place to break a scent trail. She had thought this through. He looked back at the park. She had run through there, a 65-year-old woman, fueled by a rage so powerful it drove her to open fire in a church. But the track hadn't just been one of rage. It was a track of calculated escape. The case, which for a moment had seemed on the verge of being solved, was now wide open again. Eleanor Ross had vanished. She had become what she was at the church, a ghost. Miller knew this was no longer a simple manhunt. To find her, he'd have to understand not just where she ran, but why. He needed to dig deeper into the lives of Marcus Vance and Eleanor Ross. He had a feeling the truth was buried somewhere in the past, and it was going to be even uglier than the blood on the church altar. The investigation hit a wall. Eleanor's apartment was clean. Her financials showed nothing unusual. She hadn't used a credit card or a phone since the shooting. She had effectively ceased to exist. For 2 days, Miller and his team chased down dead-end leads, the initial adrenaline of the case curdling into a slow, grinding frustration. Miller found himself drawn back to the family. He knew the key wasn't in Eleanor's escape route, but in the reason she ran. He requested another interview with Marcus's sister, Simone Vance. She had been a witness, yes, but her reaction at the church, that cry of, "No," felt different from the screams of the other guests. It was a cry of recognition, of a nightmare realized. They met in a sterile gray interview room at the station. Simone looked exhausted, the skin under her eyes bruised with lack of sleep. She sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap. "Ms. Vance, thank you for coming in again," Miller began, his tone gentle but firm. "Your brother is stable. He's going to pull through. That's the good news." Simone nodded, a flicker of relief in her eyes. "The bad news," Miller continued, leaning forward, "is that a dangerous fugitive is still at large. I need your help to find her. I need you to tell me everything you know about the relationship between your brother and Eleanor Ross." Simone's guard went up immediately. "I told you, I didn't know her. I knew Marcus was seeing someone, an older woman. I told him to end it, that's all." Miller watched her closely. She was lying, or at least holding something back. Her gaze kept darting away, her answers too rehearsed. He decided to change tactics, to push on the emotional bruise. "Your brother lied to everyone," Miller said, his voice flat. "He lied to his fiancée, he lied to you, and he lied to Eleanor Ross. This tragedy is the result of those lies. But I have a feeling he wasn't the only one keeping a secret." The polarity in the room was palpable. Miller's calm, probing search for truth versus Simone's frantic, desperate attempt to keep a terrible secret buried. Simone flinched. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Miller pressed, his voice hardening slightly. "When Eleanor Ross walked into that church, you weren't just shocked, Ms. Vance. You were horrified. I saw your face. It was the look of someone seeing their worst fear come true. What was that fear? What is the real story here? What are you so terrified of?" He let the questions hang in the air. The silence in the small room was deafening. Simone's composure began to crumble. Her shoulders shook, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "You have to protect him," she whispered, more to herself than to Miller. "Protect him from what? From the truth?" Miller's voice softened again. "The truth is already out there, covered in blood on a church floor. Hiding it now only helps the woman who put a bullet in his chest. Tell me what you know, Simone. Tell me the secret." He had used her first name. The shift from formal to personal was the final key. A dam inside her broke. A gut-wrenching sob escaped her, the sound of a lifetime of pain and confusion. She looked up at him, her eyes flooded with a sorrow so profound it chilled him to the bone. The words came out in a ragged, choked whisper. "You don't understand," she wept. "It wasn't just an affair. It was, oh God, it was so much worse." Miller waited, his pen poised over his notepad. He knew he was on the precipice of the real story. Simone took a shuddering breath, her voice barely audible. "When we were kids, our mother left us, just disappeared. We never knew what happened to her." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if the next words were physically painful to say. "Eleanor Ross, the woman from the diner, the woman who shot him." She choked on the words, shaking her head in disbelief at the horror she was about to unleash. "Detective," she finally managed, looking Miller straight in the eye, her face a mask of agony and shame. "She isn't just his lover. She's our mother." The confession landed in the sterile room with the force of a physical blow. Miller froze, his pen still poised. The entire case shifted, contorted into something monstrous and tragic. This wasn't a story of a scorned lover. This was a Greek tragedy playing out in a Texas suburb. It was a story of abandonment, incestuous desire born of trauma, and a secret so dark it had finally exploded into violence. He now understood the shooter's rage, the victim's lies, and the sister's terror. He was no longer hunting a simple fugitive. He was hunting a grieving mother who had shot her own son. Simone's confession was the Rosetta Stone that deciphered the entire twisted narrative. Miller felt a grim, cold clarity settle over him. He now understood the unnatural pull between Marcus and Eleanor, the deep, sorrowful look in Marcus's eyes that Simone had described, and the explosive, possessive rage that had led to the shooting. It was all rooted in one catastrophic foundational wound, a mother's abandonment. Leaving a shaken Simone with a victim's advocate, Miller went straight to the county archives. An hour of digging through dusty birth certificates and old public records confirmed it. Eleanor Ross was listed as the mother on the birth certificates of both Simone and Marcus Vance. The father was listed as a man with a long record of petty crimes and domestic disturbances, who had died in a bar fight 15 years ago. The story was there, written in faded ink and bureaucratic stamps. The new narrative was horrifyingly clear. Marcus, haunted by a mother he couldn't remember, had unconsciously sought her out. He found in Eleanor a comfort and acceptance that felt primal because it was. When he discovered the truth, and Miller was certain he must have at some point, he was trapped. How could he abandon the mother who had already abandoned him once? How could he choose between the woman who gave him life and the woman who offered him a new one? So he chose neither, and in doing so, destroyed both. Miller drove to the hospital. Marcus had been moved from the ICU to a private room. He was pale and hooked up to monitors, but his eyes were clear, and they were filled with a terrible, hollowed-out shame. Aaliyah was not there. A nurse told Miller she had packed her things and left a note with Marcus's sister. She was gone. The bright, clean future had been irrevocably stained. Miller pulled a chair up to the bedside. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We know, Marcus," he said, his voice low and devoid of judgment. "We know Eleanor is your mother." Marcus didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his temple. The fight was gone. There was only surrender. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Not at first, I swear. It was just a feeling, a connection I couldn't explain. She felt like home." He recounted the story, his voice filled with a self-loathing that was painful to witness. He talked about their affair, the passion, the secrecy. Then he told Miller about the night, about a year into their relationship, when he found an old, faded photograph tucked into a book in her apartment. It was a picture of a younger Eleanor holding two small children, a little girl with serious eyes and a little boy with his own face. "I confronted her," he said, his voice breaking. "She broke down, told me everything, the abuse, the poverty, running away, leaving us. She was so ashamed. She begged me not to tell Simone." "So you knew," Miller stated. "For 2 years, you knew you were sleeping with your mother." It wasn't like that after I knew," Marcus insisted, his face contorting in agony. "It changed. The physical part, it stopped. But the connection was deeper. She was my mother. My secret mother. I couldn't lose her again. But I loved Aaliyah. I wanted that life. I thought I could have both. I thought I could keep them in separate worlds, protect them from each other." The tragic naivete of it was staggering. He had tried to compartmentalize a truth so explosive it was destined to detonate. "I'm an idiot," Marcus whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I'm a monster." "You were a man with a wound you never let heal," Miller said, the words coming out softer than he intended. "And it got infected." He leaned in closer. "I don't care about your sins, Marcus. I care about finding her before she hurts someone else, or herself. She's out there alone. Where would she go? A place she feels safe, a place from the past." Marcus stared at the ceiling for a long moment, his mind traveling back through the fractured memories of his childhood. He thought of the stories Eleanor had told him in the dead of night, stories of a brief, fleeting time before everything fell apart. "There was a house," he said, his voice barely audible, "before we moved into town, a little rental place out on the old county road. It was the last place we were all together as a family. She said she still dreams about the porch swing." He gave Miller the cross streets, a location long forgotten by most, a place that existed only in the memories of a broken family. Miller nodded, stood up, and walked to the door. He had his destination. He was no longer chasing a fugitive. He was going to the end of a tragedy, to the place where it all began. The old county road was barely more than a dirt track, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. It led to a small, dilapidated clapboard house, tilting slightly to one side as if exhausted by the weight of its own history. The porch swing Marcus had mentioned hung from a single rusted chain, swaying gently in the hot Texas breeze. This was it, the ghost's final sanctuary. Miller had his team establish a perimeter, but he chose to approach the house alone. This wasn't a raid. It was a reckoning. Kicking in the door felt wrong. This situation called for a quiet end, not more violence. He walked up the creaking steps and found the front door unlocked. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and damp memories. In the dim light filtering through grimy windows, he could see the outlines of a life left behind. He moved through the small living room and found her in what must have been a child's bedroom. Eleanor Ross sat on the floor, her back against a wall where faded cartoon animals were peeling away. She was staring at a small handprint, preserved in a patch of dried plaster. She looked smaller, frailer than she had in the church. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by the gray ash of utter desolation. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "Is he?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. "He's alive," Miller said softly. "He's going to live." A sound that was half sob, half sigh escaped her lips. She closed her eyes, a kind of peace settling on her features. It was the peace of a burden finally laid down. "I never wanted to hurt him," she said, her eyes still closed. I wanted him to feel it, just for a second, the pain of being erased." Miller didn't say anything. He simply stood there, a witness to the final quiet scene of the tragedy. There were no cuffs needed at first, no raised voices. The arrest was a silent, somber affair. As he led her out of the house, she didn't resist. She seemed to welcome it. The weight of her secret had been a heavier prison than any cell they could put her in. The aftermath rippled through Little Elm. Aaliyah James, as promised, never came back. She sent a single letter to Simone, expressing a sorrow too deep for words, and then she disappeared, seeking a place where she could rebuild her life from the ashes. Marcus recovered physically, but his soul was scarred for life. He sold his workshop and left town, a man condemned to be haunted by two ghosts, the mother he'd lost twice and the future he'd destroyed with his own hands. Eleanor Ross faced the justice of the courts. Her defense attorney argued temporary insanity, a plea born of a lifetime of trauma. The story of her past, of the abuse and the impossible choice she'd made as a young mother, came to light, painting a portrait not of a monster, but of a woman broken by circumstances beyond her control. She was found guilty of a lesser charge, her sentence tempered by the profound and tragic mitigation of her history. Weeks later, sitting at his desk and typing the final report on the case, Detective Miller paused. His retirement was just over a year away, and for the first time, he felt the true weight of the stories he carried. He thought of Marcus, Aaliyah, and Eleanor, three people, all searching for a home, for a love that would heal them, who had instead created a vortex of destruction. He realized the story wasn't just about a love triangle, or a family secret, or even a shooting. It was about the corrosive power of unspoken trauma. The final lesson was clear, and it was one Miller would carry into his retirement. The wounds of the past, if left to fester in the dark, do not fade with time. They metastasize. They twist love into obsession, turn secrets into weapons, and poison the soil of the future so that nothing new can ever grow. The most dangerous ghosts are not the ones that haunt old houses, but the ones we carry inside ourselves,